They never needed to force anything into your mind. They just needed to hand you the box, and trust that your own hands would do the rest. What if the most dangerous myth was never meant to warn you? There is a story so old it has become invisible, not because it disappeared, but because it was repeated so many times, in so many forms, that the mind stopped questioning it. Pandora, the first woman shaped from clay, gifted by every god on Olympus, sent to humanity carrying something no one asked for. The story has been told as a lesson about curiosity, about disobedience, about the dangers of wanting to know too much. But what if that framing was the trap itself? The version most people learn goes like this. Pandora opens a container she was told never to open, releases suffering into the world, and only hope remains trapped inside. Clean, moral, simple, and that simplicity is exactly what makes it effective as a tool of symbolic conditioning. Because the real question was never what was inside the box. The real question is who built it, who filled it, and who decided to place it in her hands. But here is what almost no one notices. In Hesiod's original text, Pandora is not a character acting on her own free will. She is a manufactured weapon. Zeus creates her specifically in response to Prometheus giving humanity fire, which in symbolic tradition represents autonomous consciousness, the ability to think independently, to perceive power structures, and challenge them. The divine response to human awakening was not destruction. It was distraction. It was Pandora. This pattern is older than Greece. It runs through recorded history with the consistency that is either a strange coincidence or evidence of something that certain groups understood and preserved deliberately. When a population gains access to something that expands its awareness, the countermove from concentrated power is never direct confrontation. It is the introduction of something irresistible that carries hidden consequences, something that feels like a gift. If this kind of analysis resonates with you, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The Pandora archetype did not stay in ancient mythology. It was studied, documented, and systematically applied. And the people who applied it did not need to believe in gods to make it work. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, a network of hermetic and philosophical societies across Europe developed something that modern academics rarely acknowledge openly: a systematic catalog of psychological archetypes derived from ancient mythology, analyzed not as literature but as functional tools for influencing collective behavior. Pandora occupied a specific position in that catalog, not as a villain, as a mechanism. The Hermetic tradition identified three structural elements in the Pandora archetype that made it uniquely powerful for purposes of social influence. First, the carrier must be perceived as desirer, not threatening. Second, the payload must be concealed inside something that appears to be a benefit. Third, the release must be irreversible, so that by the time the consequences are visible, the origin has been forgotten. These three elements together describe not a myth, but a template that has been applied across centuries with remarkable consistency. And this is where it gets unsettling. When you begin mapping this template onto structures that emerged in the 20th century, the alignment is difficult to dismiss. Mass media promised connection and delivered manufactured consensus. Consumer culture promised fulfillment and delivered compulsive dependency. Digital platforms promised freedom of expression and delivered the most comprehensive surveillance architecture in human history. Each of these followed the Pandora structure precisely: beautiful on the surface, consequential underneath, and by design, impossible to close once open. These interpretations appear across centuries and cultures, often studied as symbolic patterns rather than literal truths, examined by historians of ideas, cultural anthropologists, and researchers in behavioral psychology. What makes this analysis particularly uncomfortable is that the people building these systems do not need to consciously reference Pandora. The archetype is not a belief. It is a pattern, and patterns operate regardless of whether the people using them understand their origin. The Hermetic scholars who cataloged these structures understood something that most modern analysts still resist: you do not need to invoke mythology to deploy it. You only need to replicate its structure. Drop a comment if you have ever received something that was presented as a gift, but carried a cost you only recognize much later. That recognition is where awareness begins. The Pandora archetype functions best in darkness, not the darkness of night, the darkness of not knowing you are inside the pattern. Why the Pandora pattern is the most efficient form of invisible control ever documented. Control through force leaves marks. It creates resistance, opposition, and eventually, collapse. Control through symbol leaves nothing visible. It operates beneath conscious awareness, embedded in the stories people tell about themselves, the values they assume are their own, the choices they believe they are making freely. The Pandora archetype is not the most dramatic form of symbolic control. It is the most efficient, because it requires the target to participate willingly in their own conditioning. This is the element that Hermetic analysts across multiple centuries kept returning to. Pandora does not impose. She offers. The container does not force itself open. It waits. And the person who opens it does so believing they are exercising autonomy, curiosity, free will. The genius of the structure is that the act of choosing to open the box is itself the mechanism of control. You cannot resist what you perceive as your own desire. But there is a detail most people miss. The same traditions that identified this archetype as a tool of power also documented the conditions under which it loses effectiveness. The Pandora structure depends entirely on the carrier being perceived as separate from what it contains. The moment the recipient understands that the gift and the consequence are a single unified design, the pattern breaks. Not because the content disappears, because the illusion of choice disappears with it, and something else takes its place. The ability to observe the mechanism rather than be operated by it. This is not abstract philosophy. It is the core principle behind some of the most sophisticated psychological research of the 20th century, conducted not in universities, but in private institutions with interests that were never made fully public. The study of how archetypes shape mass behavior, how symbols bypass rational thought, how narratives install beliefs that feel like personal convictions. The Pandora template sits at the center of all of it. If this content is opening something in your perception, leave a like. It helps this channel continue building. This kind of analysis, modern power does not announce itself. It arrives wrapped in something you wanted, and by the time you feel the weight of what was inside, the hands that placed it in yours are long out of frame. What if the oldest protection against invisible influence was hidden inside the myth itself? In the Western occult tradition, particularly within the ceremonial and folk magic systems that flourished across Britain and continental Europe from the 16th to the 18th centuries, there existed a specific category of protective workings designed for what practitioners called unsolicited entry, the arrival of influence that was never consciously invited, but gained access through the open doors of desire, curiosity, or trust. The protection was not built to destroy the influence. It was built to make it visible, because in the symbolic logic of these traditions, what can be seen cannot possess. Only what remains invisible can truly occupy. The practice, documented across multiple grimoires and private manuscripts under various names, most commonly referred to as the threshold seal or the binding of the given door, works through a precise sequence that is entirely applicable to modern life, whether in professional environments, personal relationships, or internal psychological patterns. The working begins in the threshold hours, either before dawn or at dusk, when the mind inhabits the space between full waking and rest. A dark candle is lit, black or deep violet, representing in the symbolic tradition the absorption of external influence rather than its summoning. On a piece of paper, you write the name of any influence, relationship, system, narrative, or environment you suspect is shaping your decisions without your full awareness. Suspicion is sufficient. Certainty is not required. But what comes next changes everything about how this practice is understood. The act of naming is itself the first layer of the seal. In every major Western esoteric tradition, naming is the act of bounding. What has no name has no limit. What is named has a border. After writing, you fold the paper 3 times toward your body, each fold symbolizing the reclamation of agency. Then you burn it in the candle flame while repeating, either aloud or internally, I see what enters, I choose what remains. The candle is extinguished by smothering, never by breath. In the tradition, breath disperses intention. Smothering seals it. What gives this practice its actual power is not supernatural. It is neurological. The act of naming, visualizing, and performing deliberate symbolic action activates the prefrontal cortex in ways that interrupt automatic behavioral patterns. Ancient occult systems documented empirically what neuroscience is still mapping. The most dangerous thing for any system of invisible control is a mind that has named what is trying to enter. How the story of Pandora was rewritten so you would never think to look inside the box. There is a final layer to this investigation that requires a specific kind of intellectual discomfort, not the discomfort of discovering you were deceived. Something more precise than that. The discomfort of recognizing that the deception was designed to feel like understanding, that the version of the story you were given was not incomplete by accident. It was edited with intention, and the editing was done so early, so thoroughly, and so consistently repeated that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. The dominant version of the Pandora myth places her as the agent of catastrophe. She opens what should have stayed closed. Humanity suffers. The lesson is about restraint, obedience, the danger of female curiosity. This version has been taught in schools, embedded in literature, repeated in psychological frameworks, and referenced in political rhetoric for centuries. Its longevity is not evidence of its truth. It is evidence of its utility. In several philosophical and esoteric traditions that operated outside the dominant cultural narrative, the reading of Pandora was fundamentally different. She was not the agent. She was the vessel. She did not fill the container with suffering. She was handed it, already filled, by a structure of power that then ensured she would be blamed for what was always going to be released. The punishment was never about what she did. It was about ensuring no one would look past her to ask who gave her the box. And this is where the modern structure of power reveals itself with a clarity that is genuinely difficult to sit with. The most sophisticated systems of symbolic control do not operate by hiding the mechanism. They operate by making sure someone else is always visible in front of it. The carrier takes the attention. The architect remains out of frame. This applies to media narratives, economic systems, cultural movements, and the personal stories you carry about your own limitations and failures. The question is never only what is in the box. The question is who built it, who filled it, and whose hands were chosen to carry it to you. If this opens something in your thinking, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every piece of content here is one more coordinate on the same map. Comment below with the word vessel if this shifted something in how you see the patterns around you, because the archetype only holds power over the mind. That has never been introduced to the hand behind it.